In our story about Disney artist Herb Ryman, we're up to the part where things are starting to get interesting. In our last episode, we explored the first 2 months of his trip with Walt Disney and other Disney artists to South and Central America, where they were gathering material to make cartoons to solidify political ties between North, Central, and South America as war raged on the other side of the world. And in today's episode, things heat up as Herb Ryman completes his 3-month journey through South and Central America, only to return home to find that the world he'd known months earlier was changing. I know my voice is a little wonky today. Everyone in my household was wiped out with the flu for a few days earlier this week. We got sick, we slept a lot, it wasn't COVID, and in a strange way this seems far more like the world we used to know, the one back before 2020, and I'm mostly good with that. So even though my voice has a little hitch today, let's dial things back to 1941 and explore the world that Herb Ryman and Walt Disney once knew. In terms of political importance, the two key countries for the South American trip were Brazil and Argentina, with Chile coming in third. Once in South America, the group was forced to change its travel and accommodation schedule more than once, with the end result being that the group spent most of their time in just 2 countries. To cover as much ground as possible after Argentina, Walt split the larger group into smaller units, each of which would visit different regions to cover as many countries as possible. Ryman chose to work with the Blairs and also Jack Miller, which focused his final month of travel along the western portion of the continent and also Central America. Their first flight was from Buenos Aires to Tucumán, Argentina, which was intended as a brief stopover before traveling to Bolivia, but weather conditions forced them to spend the night. There they took a horse-drawn carriage through town and went to bed early at the Hotel Savoy, hopeful of some sleep before an early morning flight. Next day, they arrived at La Paz, Bolivia, a city set in the mountains with an elevation of over 11,000 feet. That afternoon, Ryman walked with Jack Miller through town, penciling drawings in his sketchbook, but by evening they felt the effects of the high altitude. In the days that followed, they sketched the colonial town and native villages. They also spent time with American photographer and journalist Fenno Jacobs, who was writing an article on Bolivia for Fortune magazine. Around this time, Ryman wrote his mother in California, "You must have been worried not hearing for such a long time, but all this time in Buenos Aires, night and day, we were busy working or entertained. The studio idea there was impractical, so we'll do our work when we get back." From La Paz, they ventured up to Lake Titicaca, a sacred site for the Incas, a place where the altitude was even higher than that of their previous city. They examined Incan ruins and pre-Columbian architecture. They sketched llamas with the belief that the llama, with its stubborn, irascible personality, might become a central character in at least one cartoon. The llamas sketched by Ryman were realistic, but still his llamas presented faces pinched with sly, mischievous personalities, figures that could, with work, be adapted for a cartoon. Lake Titicaca was lovely, 50 miles of endless blue, like a small ocean hidden atop the peaks. They all agreed that the lake would be an ideal location for a cartoon, as the lake connected 2 countries and could therefore represent both Peru and Bolivia, so long as the cartoon didn't specify on which side of the lake the story was set. Now that they were away from Walt, they could slide down into a pleasurable anonymity where they blended into crowds and became simple artists exploring the rich cultural and natural offerings around them. Gone was the celebrity fanfare and diplomatic prestige associated with the Disney name. Gone also were their ties to American culture. They heard no programs from American radio. Nor did they find American newspapers in the lobby of their hotels. Cinemas, when they came across them, showed films created by South American studios rather than those imported from the U.S. They were now being lowered on the soft ropes of curiosity down into the heart of another culture, where they could see the landscape around them with greater clarity. They spent days in Peru, then traveled to Ecuador and Guatemala. They bought art books, believing that they would be useful for later research. They sketched indigenous people as they created pottery. They bought Guatemalan dolls as a gift for Walt. They went to a bullfight. On October 18th, they flew to Mexico City, the last country they would visit before returning home. There they visited a museum on Mayan and Aztec art. Mary Blair produced a stack of drawings and watercolors, many representing children dressed in native costume, while Ryman focused more on landscapes and natural features. On October 20th, they took a taxi out to Lake Xochimilco, where they hired a boatman to ferry them past the famous floating gardens. Around them, trees and flowering bushes rose from small man-made islands. Finally, on October 22nd, Herb Ryman, Jack Miller, and Lee and Mary Blair boarded a Pan Air flight that carried them back to Burbank to their old homes, where people now talked more often about the war expanding in Europe. Even at the studio, the war was a common topic, as just down the street at the Lockheed Martin plant, Disney employees knew that military aircraft were being produced, possibly for the conflict overseas. By the time Ryman returned to the studio, the strike was over and Dumbo was finished, with the print already in New York for its premiere at the Broadway Theater. The studio, however, was changed from the one he had known before his trip. Most notably, it was a far smaller operation. Before the strike, the studio had employed nearly 1,200 individuals. By October 1941, it was down to under 700 workers, a 40% reduction. Without a slate of full-length animated features, the studio simply couldn't support a large workforce. The trend to trim labor, specifically the possibility of more layoffs, increased tensions on the lot. Beyond this, many employees still felt the recent injuries caused by the strike. Some pro-union artists resented anti-union artists for crossing the picket line, and some anti-union artists resented pro-union artists for intimidating them each time they came to work by announcing their names with a note of shame over the sound system. These tensions were particularly troubling on floors where striking animators and non-striking animators worked side by side. Animator Ward Kimball recalled watching 5 pro-union workers walking down the hall 5 abreast, not letting anybody walk through. During the 3 months that Ryman had been away, the focus of the studio had also changed. Apart from Bambi, the studio was now focused on cartoon shorts. Animators worked on traditional comic shorts, such as The Art of Self-Defense with Goofy, Chef Donald, and Mickey's Birthday Party. But to bring in money, they also worked on a set of 4 propaganda films for the Canadian government to increase the sale of war bonds. The first of these efforts, a cartoon called The Thrifty Pig at 4 minutes, mixed new animation with previously animated sequences. Artists redid scenes of the Big Bad Wolf from The Three Little Pigs released 8 years earlier to transform him into a Nazi officer, while the pigs sang out about the importance of buying war bonds. Likewise, 7 Wise Dwarfs, the next film in the series, mixed previously finished animation of the dwarves in their diamond mine from Snow White with new animation of them trading in their jewels at the post office and bank for tall stacks of Canadian bonds. Likewise, the remaining 2 titles, Donald's Decision and All Together, mixed new animation with old to support a similar message. Beyond sequences featuring familiar Disney characters, all these cartoons featured highly realistic animated scenes of warfare, with tanks, planes, and ships defending Canadian interests from Germany. For now, Ryman would not work on wartime propaganda films. Instead, he would focus his efforts on the South American project. To develop cartoons with South American themes, Norm Ferguson set up a special production unit on the third floor, Wing 3A, to review the material the team had researched or collected and to outline the first set of 4 cartoons. The plan at this point, as outlined in the CIAA Disney contract, was to release 12 cartoons in groups of 4. The challenge, as many artists saw it, was to arrange the material so that the good neighbor message did not overwhelm the warmth, charm, and humor typically arranged into a Disney short. During that fall, the South American unit focused on 4 topics that would ideally create 4 or perhaps 5 cartoons, with one perhaps being saved for a later wave. Donald Duck's adventures around Lake Titicaca, located in a region explored by Ryman, the Blairs, and Jack Miller. Pedro the Mail Plane, who flies over high mountains between Chile and Argentina, a musical fantasy focused on the samba, featuring Donald Duck and Jose Carioca, the parrot figure developed in part by Ryman in Brazil, and 2 cartoons related to gaucho culture in Argentina. Ryman wanted to work on one of the gaucho pictures. He had enjoyed meeting Molina Campos in Rio and knew that he would visit the studio the following March as a consultant. The gaucho story on which Ryman worked was initially called The Flying Donkey, about a young boy who discovered a winged burro, but was later renamed The Remarkable Donkey, and finally The Flying Gauchito. The Flying Gauchito was developed alongside at least one other gaucho story, in which Goofy, as a Texas cowboy, travels to Argentina to learn the ways of his South American counterpart, the gaucho, though it was the Flying Gauchito that best presented the lore and culture of the South American grasslands. As the initial art director for this project, Ryman developed the cartoon using colors familiar to Campos's own paintings. A kind of a muddy black and white, Ryman explained, with browns and other earth tones far from the brilliant colors that defined most of the studio's output during those years. In this, he hoped to incorporate the visual sensibilities of a Campos painting into the world of animation. Walt had never done anything in such a muted palette before, Ryman added. I was surprised that he would consent to it. As a matter of fact, he insisted upon it. For Ryman, the position of art director over a cultural project was an elevation in his role at the studio. His office on the third floor kept him away from post-strike unpleasantries and also kept him close to the decision-making center of the studio. Using Campos's paintings and his own experience in Argentina, Ryman defined how this material would be presented on screen. It was his first time to oversee the visual presentation of an entire project. But these responsibilities were not the only way his life was changing during these months. When Ryman returned from South America, he was better connected with the Disney studio. Before the strike, he had looked at Disney as a job, a good job, but still a job. Now he saw the Burbank studio as central to his social life. Not since his days in art school or his childhood in Decatur had he had friends as close as those from the trip. Most days he invited people over to his office where he arranged chairs for small gatherings. His afternoon soirees, though loved by his friends, didn't go unnoticed by studio management. I was always a fun-loving person, Ryman explained, and studio manager Ben Sharpstein was afraid that I would lead too much of a social life and entertain and never get any work done. One day in the hallway, Sharpstein cornered Ryman. You know, Herb, you're running a social club in there, he said. I'm going to put you in an office across from me. Oh, fine, I'd love that, he said. Once Ryman was in his new office, whenever Sharpstein walked by, he closed Ryman's door, forcing him to focus on work. Every once in a while he'd look in, Ryman said, but he didn't seem much bothered by Sharpstein's issues of control. Ryman knew that after South America, he now had a small bit of power at the studio. Walt not only liked his work, Walt liked him as well. That fall, Herbie felt his relationship with Walt and Lillian change yet again. He saw Walt socially, particularly as Walt's sister-in-law Hazel and her husband Bill Cottrell lived near him. Herbie, often accompanied by his mother, visited Walt and Lillian at the Cottrells' house, and while there, his mother invited Walt for an evening at Ryman's house. She'd invite Walt and Lily and Hazel and Bill over here, Ryman said, and we'd have chicken fries. Though Walt occasionally invited select studio artists to his house, this was one of the few times where in the 1940s, Walt attended a social event at an artist's house. During these same months, Herbie also saw his sister's career improve. By this point, Lucille had transferred from Universal to Herbie's old studio MGM, where she again worked in the casting department. Previously for Universal, she had searched for general screen talent, but now she was a casting director for specific films, which was a substantial elevation in her role. But for Herbie, the good feelings of the post-trip period did not last long. By the fall of 1941, the United States faced two diplomatic and military challenges. The first was in the Pacific, specifically in regards to Japanese aggression in Asia. After the Japanese invasion of China in 1937 and later its invasion of French Indochina in 1940, the U.S. placed sanctions on Japan that, among other things, greatly reduced its ability to import iron, copper, oil, and gas. The U.S. believed, or at least hoped, that the problems with Japan could be managed through sanctions and embargoes. The more serious problem, as viewed by government officials, involved Nazi aggression in Europe, but these two problems developing at the same time meant that the United States needed to engage in complex planning. To better understand how American military actions would affect the situations with Japan and Germany, U.S. Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark presented President Roosevelt with a series of options. He considered war with Japan, also war with Germany and Italy, with or without the help of the British. Stark also considered the possibility of remaining out of the war entirely, choosing instead to protect only North, Central, and South America from overseas aggression. The United States, he noted, might find limited success with an isolationist approach, but this approach would likely lead to continued threats from Germany, Italy, and Japan in the years to come. Another cost of isolationism would be the likely fall of the UK, which would place much of Europe under Nazi control and remove one of America's key global allies, as England could not successfully stand against Germany by itself. Stark's conclusion was that America would likely need to enter the European war at some point to help defeat the Nazis for its own security, even though for the past 20 years the American public had not been eager to enter another conflict similar in scope to the First World War. By December 1941, many Americans believed that the country was inching toward war with Germany. In the Atlantic, Navy ships shot torpedoes at German U-boats, who fired back. Though a declaration of war with Germany would have prompted many Americans to feel anxiety and concern, it would not have been a shock. But this was not how America entered the war. America's entry into the war, for the most part, was a complete surprise, one that left Americans feeling exposed and vulnerable. Instead of bowing to sanctions and embargoes, Japan planned to control shipping routes in the South Pacific so they could secure scrap iron, copper, gas, and raw materials in the countries and colonies of Southeast Asia, rather than from the U.S. High-level American officials were aware of a possible Japanese attack in the Pacific, but most assumed that such an attack, if it happened at all, would be directed at the Philippines, in an area central to the shipping routes the Japanese wanted to control. No one expected that an initial attack would be directed on the U.S. territory of Hawaii. On December 7, 1941, Japanese sent its first air fleet of over 400 planes, along with 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and other vessels, within striking range of an American military base in Hawaii. The surprise attack devastated the naval installation, sinking or badly damaging all 8 battleships stationed there. Roughly 9 hours later, the Japanese attacked a U.S. airfield in the Philippines. American losses in the Philippines were similar to those in Hawaii. Ryman learned about the attack during those weeks he worked on The Flying Gauchito. That was a pretty cataclysmic thing for all of us, he said. Walt learned about the attack while at home. It was on the radio, he said. A few hours later, Walt received a call from a studio manager to inform him that military officers were at the studio gates. Walt, he explained, the Army is moving in on us. They came up and said they wanted to move in. Walt then learned that the military had identified the Disney lot with its covered parking and large indoor stage as an ideal place to house troops and equipment, both of which would be used to protect the Lockheed Martin plant just down the road, as the aircraft plant was now a key military installation. On the phone, Walt asked if he could speak to a supervisor. "Call him," the officer said, "but we're still moving in anyway." The underlying rationale for the repurposing of the studio, which was likely not yet clear to Walt, was that the Army was given a unique policing and defense authority within a radius of 2 miles from all airport and defense production plants in the area, which included Lockheed Martin. But the military didn't simply move into the studio. They moved into the entire area, as the region was viewed as vulnerable to an air attack and also viewed as a production zone central to the military development. That night, residents in the San Fernando Valley saw blades of light move through the sky, high-powered beams so that men on the ground could track each plane overhead. Though local planes had been grounded since 3:45 p.m., planes from other cities still passed through Southern Californian airspace. It was later explained that the moving beams picked up several passenger planes in cross-country flight and followed them until their absolute identity had been established. The following day, the military asked Walt to remove production equipment from its soundstage. "Get this stuff out of here," they said. In its place, they moved in anti-aircraft guns, clearly in preparation for a possible Japanese attack. They stored a few million rounds of ammunition in studio parking garages and storage sheds. They needed billeting space for their troops, with enlisted men living in different areas than officers, as presently some men were simply staying nearby in Griffith Park. They were sleeping in every room we could find, Walt explained. "I had to double my artists up in rooms so that an officer could have a place to sleep. They had their sleeping bags down on the floors and everything, and they set up their own mess kitchen." They parked their trucks on the lot and draped sand-toned netting between the roofs of buildings to camouflage them. They also set up their own security at each entrance to the studio lot. On that same day, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Walt received a call from the Navy, who requested that the studio make training films for new recruits. They believed that films with animated sections would be the quickest way to train thousands of men signing up for duty. The offer was for 20 short films with a total payment of $90,000. "We need it right away," the Navy told him. "We want the first film in 90 days. Money received from these films Walt knew would help keep the studio open. On the phone, Walt responded, "Yes, sir." Americans were stunned by the attack. President Roosevelt declared war against Japan. For the first time, those on the West Coast, particularly those near large cities such as Los Angeles or San Francisco, feared that the Japanese would continue to venture across the Pacific, eventually sending their planes to Washington, Oregon, or California. To prepare, officials recommended that residents have fabric on hand to black out their windows so that light from apartments and homes could not easily be spotted from the air. In the city of Van Nuys, where Ryman and his mother lived, dozens volunteered to staff a warning post where, around the clock, they watched the skies for enemy planes. and 3,000 volunteered for the auxiliary police, mostly men too old to serve in the military, to protect and organize local neighborhoods during an attack. Volunteers met at an office formerly used by the Van Nuys Piano Company, with typewriters, lights, and other equipment donated by local citizens. Men who owned station wagons were urged to join a special area-wide squad where their cars could be used as makeshift ambulances and transport vehicles. This effort was organized by the California State Guard and proved particularly popular among celebrities over 40. Among those who volunteered were actors Buster Keaton, Jack Holt, and Robert Young. At this point, the U.S. was only at war with Japan. Though President Roosevelt had been maneuvering American assets toward a war with Germany, to do this, he still needed to make the case to the American people, many of whom were skeptical about plans to insert U.S. troops into conflicts overseas. But Roosevelt never needed to make his case. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the U.S. as America presently appeared weak after the staggering losses in Hawaii and the Philippines. With this declaration, the U.S. faced war on its west coast in the Pacific leading to Japan and on its east coast in the Atlantic leading to Europe. Once engaged in a bicoastal war, President Roosevelt was able to set the agenda. Government leaders clearly viewed Germany as the larger threat and prioritized resources to the European theater, choosing instead to sequester the Japanese threat if possible in the far Pacific. Only after the German threat was vanquished would the U.S. focus its full attention on Japan. These policies would also shape how the Disney studio, through later government films, engaged the war, with much of their output directed at the German threat, even though, as a California business, the more tangible threat came from Japan. With war declared, President Roosevelt needed to raise money to fund the effort, which was accomplished in large part through a deep revision to the federal tax code. In 1939, only 5% of American workers paid a federal income tax. But now President Roosevelt proposed a massive expansion in which roughly 75% of American workers would eventually be subject to this tax. Roosevelt estimated that the federal government needed to increase total tax receipts from $7 billion during the previous year, 1941, to $12 billion in the coming year, 1942, to a projected $18 billion in 1943. To this end, 1 week after Pearl Harbor, Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau contacted the Disney studio with a request to make a cartoon that would encourage Americans to pay their taxes. Though Americans already had a legal obligation to pay taxes, such a film would focus on the moral and patriotic obligation to do so. Tax payments turned in on time would save the government substantial costs in tracking down late and non-filing individuals. As with other government-funded projects, this film needed to be completed quickly, with storyboards set for review during the first week of January, and the finished film to be previewed in Washington, D.C. on February 2nd. Such a turnaround time was unheard of for a Disney animated project, but Walt accepted this assignment as well. By this point, everyone at the studio knew that the war would eat into the anticipated profits from Dumbo, leaving Walt once again looking for ways to financially support his company. All month in California, local newspapers reported new clashes in the Western Pacific between American and Japanese fleets. Some of these clashes were unconfirmed, but still received front-page newspaper coverage, which served to escalate anxiety felt by those who lived in the region. The government started a system of rationing. Most notably, it prohibited the sale of new cars and trucks, pending a yet-to-be-announced curtailment system, as such production would largely be needed for the military. Even New Year's Eve festivities were revised. Throughout Southern California, the police and the military ordered celebrations be held only inside, where lights and large gatherings could not be seen by enemy planes overhead. It was a boon to hotels and nightclub owners, but another reminder as to the threat that existed across the water. Ryman saw these changes all around him. Navy enlistments in Los Angeles were up 500% in the days following the country's entry into war. Stores quickly relabeled existing supplies of thick fabric as blackout cloth, even though textile officials explained that there was no such material as blackout cloth, and that blankets, quilts, bedspreads, and other thick cloths already in a person's possession should more than adequately hold the light. And even if customers wanted blackout cloth, they could only purchase it during the day, as all merchants were required to close at night, switching off all signs, window displays, and even foot-level nightlights. Each time Ryman came to the studio, he needed to show his ID to government guards. On his way to the animation building, he walked past soldiers in uniform. A few production rooms were now marked closed, as they contained top-secret information required for the Navy training films. Some employees worked modified hours so they could shop for groceries before stores closed at dusk. For weeks, most everyone checked the horizon, fearful of finding Japanese planes there. Walt Disney himself reviewed the procedures employees should follow if the studio was attacked. Upon hearing the emergency signal, he wrote, "Walk, do not run, to the place designated for your safety and cooperate in every way with the wardens for your particular area. Panic is dangerous. Please remain calm. These precautions have been taken for your protection. And while we hope that no such emergency will arise, we must be prepared at all times." Ryman could see that Walt's grand vision to release 2 animated features a year was now part of the old world, the one that existed before Pearl Harbor. Also falling away was his vision to make a studio campus focused on the needs of his artists. If there was one small positive change that arrived during this time, it was this. The bad feelings of the strike faded into the past, as most artists focused on the more serious threat of war. "So now we face the big question mark of the future," Ryman said. "All our dreams go up in smoke. No more films, no more Disney films, no more anything. And here we had the studio, everything was so nice, and now it's all gone." One by one, Ryman watched his studio friends sign up for the military, including some from the South American team. Lee Blair was assigned to create training films for the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics. Frank Thomas was assigned to the Army's 1st Motion Picture Unit to make propaganda and training films for the troops. Others were out taking photographs and drawing sketches of troops to be published back home. As he heard of their plans, Ryman considered what he might do during the war. "I could probably go to Washington, D.C., he said, and probably get in with some form of mapping or camouflage department or motion picture films." He considered field work for a magazine, creating illustrations to elevate morale on the home front. He almost surely had contact with Fenno Jacobs, the photojournalist he had met in Bolivia, who was now a Navy photographer capturing images in Los Angeles to present the human face of the war effort. Hearing that Ryman was considering military service or war-related jobs, one day at lunch, Walt sought him out at the commissary. They talked for a while. Then Walt lifted his eyes in such a way to capture his attention. "What are you going to do about the war?" Walt said. "I would like to have an assignment," Ryman began. "I'd like to be with Life and Time, and I'd like to do what some of the men are doing, some of my friends, going to the different fronts and doing watercolors and doing reporting." Walt waited for him to finish. "Herbie," he continued, "that's not the way to win the war. I didn't say I was going to win the war. That's what I wanted to do. Again, Walt nodded his head. Then Ryman presented another possibility. I suppose that I can get into the Navy in some kind of photographic unit. Well, I hope you don't, Walt said. I've got to have somebody here to keep this studio alive. This whole studio's going to die if you guys all go somewhere. I don't know what to tell you, Ryman said. I'd like to stay. Walt lowered his head, indicating that he understood how Ryman was pulled in different directions. Then he laid out an alternate plan. I've got contracts, Walt explained. We're considering doing war training films. If you stay here with me, you'll be exempt from any draft. I can guarantee you that. If you go to Washington, D.C., do you know what will happen to you? They'll find out that you've been with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. They'll put you in the film business in Washington, D.C. Walt leaned in to make his point. You'll be stuck in some office with some goddamn civilian colonel as your boss. You'll be there until the war ends. Ryman asked, when's the war going to end? I don't know, Walt answered, but you'll be there until it ends. By the time their discussion was over, Ryman knew what he'd do during the war. He'd stay with the studio. It was a type of service, one that likely had more meaning than working with an Army or Navy film unit. Among the other artists who also stayed at the studio were Ward Kimball, Mark Davis, and Ryman's old friends from MGM, Ken Anderson and Claude Coates. During this period, Ryman continued to grow close to Walt and his family. I got to know him as a friend, he said, as a very intimate person that I could be with, talk with. I suppose one of the reasons Walt liked me was that I never asked him for anything or demanded anything, so we got along very well. A lot of people took advantage of Walt's friendship and asked for raises. Consequently, I never made very much at the Disney studio, but it was a good arrangement because I still didn't need a lot of money. Ryman also made a mental list of qualities that he admired in Walt. Walt had a very affectionate, ingratiating smile, Ryman explained, very contagious enthusiasm. He could look at you and talk to you. And he had an almost hypnotic enthusiasm. By the start of 1942, Walt and Roy reconsidered ways that the first wave of South American shorts could be delivered to theaters. Individual cartoons they knew would bring in the lowest receipts, though before the trip the studio had briefly explored an option whereby shorts, or at least some of them, might be combined into a musical feature like Fantasia. This idea returned as Ryman, Mary Blair, and others developed the initial set of stories. Even producer David O. Selznick, one of Ryman's old bosses, sent a letter to Walt encouraging him to present the shorts as a feature-length presentation. Could the shorts be so built, Selznick wrote, that they could all be put together with very little additional work to make a review? Beyond an economic justification to create a feature stitched together from individual cartoons, Walt increasingly became aware of a cultural rationale to assemble the shorts in this way. The project was presently being developed so that each cartoon would represent one region, which allowed for a greater specificity in terms of how the multiple cultures of South America were represented on screen. But this plan also contained a problem that the studio hadn't previously considered. The distributor for Disney Films explained to Walt, if we try to release the Brazilian cartoon in the Argentine, they won't want it, and we can't sell the Argentine cartoon in Brazil. South American theaters, it was pointed out, would most want the one cartoon that represented their home culture and would be less interested in those that explored the culture of neighboring countries. You've got to put these together somehow, the film distributor advised. Initially, the studio considered a plan whereby the first 4 South American shorts would be released in the U.S. as individual cartoons, as stated in the CIAA contract, but would be packaged together for South American distribution, thereby encouraging countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Peru to see the entire feature, not just the one cartoon set in their home country. But eventually, Walt decided to combine the initial 4 cartoons with the approval of the CIAA into a very short feature for both the domestic and the foreign markets. As the cartoons themselves, when combined, would only run a half hour, Walt decided to fill out the feature with live-action documentary footage captured by the Disney team while in South America. Much as The Reluctant Dragon had been a highly produced and lately fictionalized semi-documentary of studio life interspersed with animation, this new feature, soon to be called Saludos Amigos, would be a highly produced and lately fictionalized semi-documentary of the Disney trip to South America interspersed with animation. Only this plan too presented a new set of problems. While in South America, the Disney team had captured footage to both document their trip for the CIAA and to provide images that would visually inspire later development on the South American cartoons. No one had considered that the footage would tell the story of the Disney artists for a theatrical audience, with multiple 3 and 4 minute sequences setting up the narrative background inspiration for each cartoon. As such, the production team discovered that many key shots, including the artists flying on the plane and the artists creating drawings and paintings, now needed to be assembled in or around the Burbank studio. It was an unusual assignment in which the studio asked Ryman and others to go back and occupy the people they had been before the war. Even though sections of the studio were now officers' barracks, Disney artists put on the clothes they had worn in South America to play slightly younger pre-war versions of themselves. They met at the Burbank airport so they could reenact climbing the steps from the tarmac into the plane. At least this time, when they put on their heavy wool clothes intended for South America, it was winter in California as well. Inside the plane, they sat in seats as though flying to South America. Though the studio had plenty of shots of gauchos, they had no shots of artists drawing or painting images of gaucho culture, which were now needed. On the lot, a camera team captured footage of the artists charcoaling out quick sketches of gauchos dancing the malambo and playing instruments, footage that would be intercut with scenes shot in Argentina. When Melina Campos visited the studio in March, a production crew mocked up a stage so that it resembled his studio in Argentina. Though the Disney artist had previously met Campos in Walt's hotel room, they now visited his fictionalized studio, as this would play better on the screen than a scene staged in a hotel room. Ryman was at most of these reenactments, including the one featuring Campos. Though he had worked at MGM for years, Ryman's name or image had never shown up on screen. But here, at Disney, not only was his name included in the credits, he was part of a feature, one that would recount his experience in South America. This was a change in Ryman's life, something that would be looked on with wonder by his childhood friends back in Illinois and also by his friends from art school. Even while wartime restrictions came down around him, even while locals looked off at the coastline fearful of finding Japanese Zeros in the sky, Ryman was rising in importance at the studio. Here he'd found a home, one with friends and a sense of importance. With America now in the war, more changes would come to the studio. He was sure of this. Changes that would continue to disrupt his life. But inside the turbulence would be little moments of wonder, like his own adventures in South America commemorated in some small way in a film produced by Disney. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan right now is to put together something a little different to look at Walt during the early days of the studio, but more on that next week. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions. You can support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber, and in return, over on Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes. But the best reason to join is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can become a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until then, this is Todd James Pierce.